the question is this transaction object here, is it just tied to this one command object? No, I could actually dim other command objects, and as long as I give it the same transaction object, they're all part of the same transaction. Absolutely. Yep. I just reused it here just for convenience, so I'm not writing a lot of code. Okay, so that's how transactions work in ADO.NET. So if we were to write that same code now using the SQL helper, let's take a look at the code that we write there. So in this case, we're going to create a new connection object. I'm going to begin a transaction on that connection, get back my transaction object, and now build my update statement, my first one, and to the execute non-query now, I'm not passing a connection string, I'm not passing a connection, I'm passing the transaction object here. And then I'm telling it it's command type of text, and that this is the SQL string. And that is now a part of that transaction. Then I build my next update statement, call SQL helper again, execute non-query, passing in the transaction object there. Okay, it does that one, and again, as long as everything succeeds, I'm going to go ahead and do the commit here. Okay. So I did cut down, again, a lot of code. I don't have to worry about the command object and stuff. All right? And then again, close the connection when I'm done, dispose if you're using Oracle, okay, and you're off and going. So it does cut down quite a bit. I wrote one more little version of this, okay, where this is my version that I've written here, where all I'm doing is building up an array of SQL statements, okay, and then I actually created my own little SQL trans helper, .execute trans. This is my own class that I wrote to even hopefully cut down the amount of code I have to write even further. This one only works in limited scenarios, but if all you're doing is like some simple update statements where you don't rely on somebody else's, like a parent-child type of thing, where you got to get the parent's ID and pass it to the child, if you just have some simple update statements to do, this is a lot less code to write here even. What does this one do? Well, I'm glad you asked. I was going to show you. This is my own class that has one shared method called execute trans, and then all I do inside of here is I basically write that same code that we just looked at. Okay, so this is my own class that I wrote. Begin the transaction, loop through each of the SQL statements, and call the execute non-query in the SQL helper. Okay, when I'm done, commit, close, and we're all done. Okay, so just one more way. So sometimes I even wrap up what they've put a wrapper around just to keep things a little bit cleaner, a little bit simpler. Simpler, 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 simpler. This is the exception management application block. Okay, now what the heck does that mean? Well, let me ask you this. You guys are writing try and catches now, right? Everybody still doing on-error go-to? Nobody's going to admit to it, I know. All right, hopefully you're not doing the on-error go-to anymore. All right, we use the try and the catch. So if I were to go and pick out some people, and I'm not going to do it, all right, but if I were to actually ask people, what do you do in your catch block? Okay, you say, well, it was kind of what I felt like that day. You know, oh, over here on this web page, I'm doing a response.write. Oh, over here on this this Windows form, I'm actually popping up a message box. Or, oh, in this one, over here, I'm writing to a label on the form, right? Okay, and then in this web page, oh, I'm redirecting to another page and passing the error over so they can look at that on a separate page. Okay, there's no consistency. There's no design pattern for really what you want to do. Okay. Then what happens? You get done, you write your whole application, and your boss comes and says, you know, every time you get an exception in your application, I'd really like to be sent an email of what the exception was. Because he's looking at you, right? You know, making sure you're doing your job. And then he says, you know, but I'd also, in certain cases, I'd also like to be able to have you write that error out to a SQL Server database or to an Oracle database. Okay? Or, hey, let's write it out to this text file over here. And all of a sudden, you're looking like, I just wrote 500,000 lines of code. Now I have to go back and add all of this to every single catch block. And that's when you say, I quit. No, just kidding. All right. So what Microsoft did, okay, is they wanted to create a design pattern so that we can handle scenarios like this. And now, obviously, we're going to still use a try and a catch and an end try. Okay, and like I said, the problem is what do you do in that catch? Display a message box, throw an exception. Hey, that's always a good one. Just throw the exception. Let somebody else handle it. Write to a file, write to the event log, write to a database, write to an email, blah, 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 whatever you're going to do. Okay? So if we were to look at, a very simple example, I'll bring up my sample here, exception management. Now I'm doing this one in WinForms. All the rest of mine will be in web. Okay, but this one, it doesn't matter which way you do it, whether you're on WinForms or WebForms. Both of these act exactly the same. Now, obviously, you know that if you run something without, any error handling, right? There's no error handling in here, and you get an error. Okay, and I've purposely created an error in here. You get some sort of funky-looking message up. Now, obviously, you don't want your user to see that, do you? Okay. So then, what you do is you wrap it up. And you say, okay, let's do a try and a catch. Okay, when I get the error here, it's going to jump down here, and I'll just do a message box.show. Which that's pretty reasonable on a Windows application. On a web app, it's a little harder, isn't it? All right, because on a web app, what do? I mean, if you do a response.write, it messes up your whole screen. You could write to a label, but then you got to make sure you have that label on every single form. There's a lot of stuff to do, a lot of things to think about. Okay, good. So you get the idea. What we want is a design pattern. And the design pattern should always look like this. You have a try, you do whatever code you're going to do, and in the catch block, you're always, first line right after your catch block is you're going to write this line of code right here. Exception manager dot publish, passing in your exception variable. After that, you do whatever you're going to do. You still need to inform the user that an error occurred, right? Okay? And that's another problem, isn't it? How many times has a user called you and said, I just had this error? Oh, wow, I'm sorry. What's the error on your screen? Oh, I don't know. I already cleared it. Right? Try to track that one down. Right? That's always been one of our problems. I mean, wouldn't our job be so much easier without users? Okay. Well, the advantage here is what I want is something inside. What does this exception manager publish do? Okay? And in my book, I don't care at this point. I really don't care what it does. All I care about is that I have now something that I can take advantage of, and I can write whatever I want for that publish. Okay? So you write code inside of that publish routine to determine where to publish that exception. The problem is, though, is now you may have it hard-coded inside of this publish. You may just say, well, we're going to write to a database. Okay, now that's still better than the other way where you'd have to go back and revisit all your catch blocks because now it's all centralized in one place. Okay, but it is kind of a finite list, and if you want to change what's inside of that exception manager.publish, you have to recompile the code too, and then redistribute that out and all that other stuff. Well, Microsoft realized that there's a lot of shortcomings there, so they created this exception management application block that we're going to take a look at. What this is a generic exception handling component, okay, that writes to the event log by default. Okay? The publishers then, inside of the configuration file, can be added dynamically. You add them through entries in your config file. That's the idea here. They give you a default one, which is write to the event log. Then you can add on whatever you want additionally, very dynamically. And I'll show you how to do that. Yeah. Is this another download? Yes, this is one of those downloads that you do have to go up to MSDN, okay, and download this. Again, just search on exception management application block. You download it, it's an MSI file, you run it, they give you the source code, you have to compile it, okay, and then once it's compiled, you can now add references to the DLLs, and there's 2 of them in this one. Yep. Good question, thank you. Yes, sir?
Does that create a custom event log file for you?
Okay, good question. The question is, does this create a custom event log for you, or does it write to some standard place? And the answer is yes. Okay, you can have it write to the application log, or you can have it create a custom event log for you. All right. However, what I'm going to tell you is that you better set up that custom event log before you run this, because if you're on a web site and you're trying to run this, guess what? The ASP.NET user does not have rights to create a new event source. Okay, so you have to set up that event source before you run it under ASP.NET. And then depending on how your desktop's locked down, you may not have rights to create an event source either. So what you'd want to do is in your installer, you'd want to write the code to actually do that installation of your new event source, okay, whatever that's going to be. Okay. Does that make sense? Fantastic. So the benefits you get out of using this is a consistent interface. Okay, it's one method call, which is nice. You can add exception publishers dynamically, and there's no need to recompile because this is all late-bound code. All right, we'll show you that. So again, search the MSDN site for exception management application block, download it, run it. They give you both the C# and VB.NET code. There's actually an interface, DLL, and then the actual code that it gives you for the default publisher. Okay? You want to compile this thing so that you have the DLLs. Then, again, set a reference to this in your project. You're going to add some config file entries that I'm going to show you in a second. And again, you might want to import the namespace here because it does get quite lengthy. Okay? Then you're going to call the exception manager.publish in every one of your catch blocks. And then optionally, you may decide to write some additional publishers. And I'm going to show you how to write one that writes to a database table and to sends out an email. Okay, so we'll do those right here. So if we were to look at this publish method, which we can, they give us full source code. Okay, if we were to take a look at this publish method, what we'd find out is that inside of there, what happens is the exception in the application publish method is called. Then inside of this thing, it determines, are any of the exception publishers defined? Have you added these entries in the config file? They have to be entered in a certain way. Okay? If no, there aren't any, then it just calls the default publisher, which writes to the event log. If we do have some more additional exception publishers defined, then it's going to read the config file list that you have of publishers, and then loop through that list of publisher, and for each of those publishers, it's going to call the publish method on each one. So you may have a publisher that says store to a database table. You may have one that says send an email. You may have one that says write out a text file, etc., etc. What do you have to do to create a new exception publisher? What you have to do is implement an interface that they give you in one of these DLLs. And then